Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ, and welcome to Wednesday in the Word. Each Wednesday evening over the last several weeks, we've tried to gather here at this time to spend some time discussing together the life and times, the story, if you will, of some character from the biblical narrative. And one of the things I've found over the last several years of preaching and teaching is that a lot of times it's easy for us to become familiar with something on a surface level with a lot of these individuals without ever really pulling the curtain back and trying to see a little bit more of their story. One of the things I think happens a lot of times too is we take basically a Sunday school version of these characters' lives and we assume that we can just take them and kind of put them in their story in a box back there in our Bible somewhere, and maybe they're so disconnected from our world that we think they have nothing new to teach us or nothing that we can learn from today. Well, I hope as we've gone through these studies together, you have had your eyes opened to the fact that these characters, though long since dead, are just as alive in the stories and the lessons and the things that they can teach us about God and about humanity and about ourselves even. Well, tonight, if you have a Bible handy and you want to open it up to where we're going to be studying from, we're going to be in the book of 1 Kings. Now, that's probably not a place we normally go to, 1 Kings or 2 Kings, to think about something being exciting, and yet there is so much historical movement during those two books that I think they are, in fact, some of the more fast-paced reading in the Scriptures. And one of the things you find here is that the kingdom that had been Israel has been divided. You remember that division happened into two parts, what we call the northern kingdom that became known as Israel, and the southern kingdom that became known as Judah. Now the northern kingdom were those 10 tribes, the southern kingdom 2 tribes, and over time we know historically that the kingdom of Israel all but vanishes from the pages of the world. They just go into obscurity and really cease in a lot of ways to exist anymore. The kingdom of Judah will eventually kind of become the focal point of the Old Testament narrative, the Hebrew Scriptures, and we'll watch the development of God's plan for redeeming the world as it unfolds through Judah. But at this point in the Scriptures, in this point of the history of God and His people, Israel has not yet faded from the pages of time, but Israel is anything but a model kingdom. In fact, as we kind of walk through historically their kings, we see that almost every single king that the northern kingdom had was bad. They just get caught in this cycle of doing things wrong and becoming unfaithful to God. And one of the things that is a perpetual problem for the kingdom of Israel is that they want to have a relationship with Yahweh, the one true God they've known, but they want to supplement that with the gods of the nations around them. They see certain gods, for instance, related to agriculture, and they think, well, if these other kingdoms are having abundant harvests, it must be because they worship those gods of the earth or the crops or the soil, and so maybe we should add that to our worship of Yahweh. Or if we see these other nations are having a lot of babies and we don't seem to be doing that, maybe it's because they worship the goddess Baal, and this idea of fertility is a part of that. And so together, maybe we just add that to our worship of Yahweh. And not only will we have all the benefits that come from Yahweh, but now we'll get the benefits of these other gods. Of course, we know from our own lives, even if we step outside of the religious idea, it's really hard to divide your heart between being loyal to two different people or two different things and trying to maintain the same. And so what happened a lot of times in their history is that Yahweh just would kind of fade into the background and the worship of these other gods would come to the foreground. Well, that's where we pick up in the story of Scripture, because we meet a guy named Omri. And Omri is a king who is as bad as any king has been before him. And maybe the worst thing that he contributes to the world is a son. Because Omri's son is a guy named Ahab. And the Bible tells us near the end of 1 Kings chapter 16 that not only did Ahab continue in the ways of his father, which were bad, but that he did it as if those things were nothing. He thought very lightly about that. And so then you see that it got worse, because not only is he continuing to lead the people of Israel into this strange mixture of worshiping God, Yahweh, and these other gods, but he marries a woman, the daughter of a neighboring king, and she's bad news. In fact, I don't know anybody that has ever named their child Jezebel, because we see her and she is mean and she is ruthless and she is wicked and she's cold and calculating, and nobody wants to think of their little girl growing up to be like her. But one of the things that she did when she came in as the wife and the co-regent of the people of Israel is that she sought to utterly destroy the worship of Yahweh, to completely destroy the prophets, to kill all those who were leading the people trying to continue to worship Yahweh. Now, she wants them gone. And she kills most, not all, but most of those prophets. So now there is a huge rise in the worship of Baal. But one of the things we begin to see as we meet Ahab and Jezebel is that they are two of the most self-serving people. And really, though Ahab is called the king, it doesn't take long to realize the real ruler during that time was Jezebel. Because whatever she said, that's what happened. Well, we meet a guy named Elijah. And we know that his name means Yahweh is my God. God is my God. Named probably not by accident. And he just shows up on the scene at the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 17. And there's not been a lead up to it. We're just introduced to Elijah from Tishbe. And we're told that he's a prophet of God. Oh, I wish we knew more about him. That's the stuff I wish I could share with you tonight, is all the backstory of who Elijah was and what his calling to be a prophet before God was like. We just meet him here, and he confronts Ahab and talks about a kingdom-wide time of famine and drought. There's going to be no rain, he says. And then the story kind of moves on a little bit, because after Elijah confronts King Ahab and tells him, hey, you need to know, a word from the Lord here, the real one, it's not going to rain. Then we move into chapter 17, and I want you to listen to what happens next in verse 3, because no rain means no crops. No crops means no food. No rain produces famine. So watch what God does here, because we're introduced to one of the major themes, I think, of the ministry, the prophetic ministry of Elijah. Again, chapter 17 of 1 Kings, verse 3. Depart from here, God said to Elijah. Turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, for I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank water from the brook. Then after a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. Now you might think, well, that's kind of weird, but how is that key or significant? Well, I think it establishes right off the bat in the life of Elijah that one of the main lessons we need to learn, one of the things that will continue to come up in the next pages of his life story, is trust in God. Things are bad. He gets the message from God, it's not going to rain, and you don't have to be the smartest guy in the world to know what that's going to mean. And God says, the thing is, I'm going to take care of you. I want you to go out here. There's a creek just outside of where you are, and there's going to be water there for you to drink, and I'm going to make sure you have plenty of food. And he even uses birds as the delivery system to feed him basically breakfast and dinner, and he had good water to drink. He trusted God. He went out there, and this was great until, indeed, the drought was so severe that there was no water left. What's Elijah to do? Well, that's where we find the word of the Lord coming to him again. And so we pick back up in the text. In verse number 9, God speaking to Elijah says, Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Sidon, one of the neighboring kingdoms. Behold, I've commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he had come to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her, and he said, Bring me a little water in a vessel that I can have a drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called her and said, Could you bring me a morsel of bread in your hand? And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little bit of oil in a jug. Even now, I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, and we may eat it and die. Well, this looks like a dire situation, doesn't it? Elijah's water source dries up. God says, it's okay. Trust me. I've got this. There's a little village over there in Sidon. I want you to go over there, and when you get over there, there's a widow, and she's going to take care of you. And so Elijah goes. Sure enough, he finds the widow. First thing he asked for is a drink of water. I don't know how long it had been since he'd had any, but she immediately left to go get him some. And he says, hey, while you're at it, I really could use a piece of bread. Apparently the ravens have stopped doing their thing as well. And the lady tells a terrible story. Sir, I'd love to, but I'm just about out of everything. In fact, I've just got enough for my son and I's last meal. We're going to eat this, and we're going to die. Then we have another lesson in trust. Elijah's trust in God was going to Zarephath. Now he's going to teach this widow something about trust in the God that she described as your God. So we pick back up in the text. Elijah said to her, Don't fear. Go and do as you've said. But first, before you make you and your son that last meal, first, make me a little cake and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. Now, this had to sound like a bizarre plan. I understand, ma'am, you got a little water and you only have enough to make a couple of little pieces of bread. But if you'll make me one first, before you make one for you and your son and bring it out here to me. Now, this had to sound really odd, but he wasn't finished with instruction. Listen to what he says after that. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Yahweh, he's speaking about here. My God, he would say. This is what he has to say. The jar of flour shall not be spent. The jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. So she went, and she did as Elijah said. And she and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent. The jug of oil did not become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken by Elijah. She learned something about trust too, didn't she? I mean, what Elijah said didn't make sense. And I don't know what she thought about the God of Elijah, the God of Israel, the God of Judah. I don't know what she believed already about Yahweh, or if she was in fact a worshiper of many other gods. But this had to be an interesting test, didn't it? To make that bread, knowing it was all you had left, and give it away to somebody else. And then to see there's just as much flour as there was to start with. And to make some for you and your son, and then to see there's still just as much oil in the flask as there was before. Trust. Trust in God. Maybe, even when it doesn't look like it makes sense, God is still a God who keeps his promises and will do what he says he'll do. Now, there's a really interesting story that happens next, beginning in chapter 17, verse 17. This woman's son, the same woman who was taking care of Elijah, this woman's son dies. And it's a sad story, and it's terrible, and she's worried about what's going to happen, and then he is brought back to life. Elijah goes up and he cries out to God, and he brings life back into this body. And it's important that you notice that this woman believed that Elijah and his God were in fact responsible for her son's death. And now Elijah can show her that Yahweh is in fact a God of life. Another moment of trust. Now, chapter 18, we have this meeting again between Elijah and Ahab, and at that time it's kind of uneventful. but it escalates very quickly into probably one of the most familiar stories from the life of Elijah, the story of what happens on Mount Carmel. They go up the mountain together. Elijah has summoned the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. Together they number 850. Elijah is the only one present as a representative of Yahweh. And they go through this exercise of building a couple of altars and placing sacrifices on the altars. And Elijah issues this challenge and says, all right, whoever's God can send fire down and take care of lighting the fire and doing these things from heaven. Whichever God can do it, we're going to have a little contest, and the winner is really God. Well, you go through this very odd experience of these prophets, and they're crying and they're yelling and they're cutting themselves, and Elijah, I think, has a little humorous fun out of them by talking about maybe they have a God who's out of the office. Maybe their God is on vacation. Maybe their God is taking a nap and they need to wake him up because nothing happens as they stand there and watch. You know the story. Elijah then calls on the God of heaven, on Yahweh, to show up and to do something in this case. An expression of his trust that Yahweh would in fact do that. Of course, he's had water brought and poured all over this thing to make it even harder. And God consumes the altar and the stones themselves, the sacrifice, the wood, and the water that's in the trench. God just consumes it all. But before this happens, I want you to hear what I think is another key verse. Elijah speaks to the people. And he says in verse 21, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Elijah said, listen, you got to choose. This is echoed in our New Testaments that no man can serve two masters or two gods. Elijah said, look, you are limping. You're not walking confidently. You have a problem that is hindering your forward mobility. And it's surrounded by the fact that you don't know who you really think is God. And sometimes you want to have Baal, and sometimes you want to have Yahweh. Make a decision. Choose. It sounds a lot like Joshua chapter 24, doesn't it? Where Joshua faces the people and said, choose this day whom you will serve. Well, it's the same kind of idea. And if you'll allow me to paraphrase the words of Elijah just a little bit in the course of our study, Elijah is saying you need to decide who you trust. You need to decide who is worth trusting with your life, with everything around you. Not just some religious exercise, but who is worthy of trust. Everything in Elijah's life says it's Yahweh. Well, when this thing ends, the prophets of Baal and Asherah are all rounded up and killed. And you would think maybe a religious revival would follow. But this enrages old Queen Jezebel. And she basically sends word to Elijah that says, if I don't do to you exactly what has been done to all these prophets, you better run. He does. In fact, after this literal mountaintop experience where Yahweh shows up and shows himself to be the powerful God of the universe, Elijah goes off terrified. He's in fear. She said, by tomorrow, I'm going to kill you. And he believes her. I won't say that he stopped trusting in Yahweh. I think everything else indicates he was still a Yahweh trusting person. But sometimes your present circumstances and your fears in the present circumstances can cause your trust in God to move into the background. And the most visible thing is what's right in front of your face. Maybe some of us even feel a little bit of that right now, this strange place between fear and trust. And it's a difficult place. And while I don't compare us to the Baal-worshiping Israelites, I do wonder if some of us don't spend a lot of years limping between one decision and another, because the things of life happen to us and cause us to question whether or not God is really God and whether or not He's really trustworthy. Well, I want you to know, even someone like an inspired prophet, a spokesman of God like Elijah, had the same struggle. And in chapter 19, verse 3, Elijah was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die. He said, "It's enough now, Lord, to take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." God, that was pretty awesome what you did back there, but you might as well just go ahead and take me. I'm ready to die. Let's get this over with. God, I trust you, and I trust you to be able to handle life and death. And God, I'm asking for death because it appears I'm all alone, and if you don't kill me, Jezebel will, and I'd rather you take me than she get me. And he just lays down and he waits. But then an angel speaks to him and says, "Hey, get up and eat." And he gets up, and miraculously there's this bread there and some water. And so he gets up and he has bread and water. And he lays back down and goes to sleep. And the angel wakes him up again. There's more bread and water. Maybe pointing him back to a time when, yes, he felt alone before, but God continued to provide for him, giving him everything he needed. And so maybe that's the point of this. And he went in the strength of what he ate for 40 days and 40 nights. The sustenance of God is a pretty amazing thing. In fact, if you'll allow me to point you forward again to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he reminds us that the one who is truly filled and satisfied is the one whose hunger and thirst is for righteousness or godness. Well, the Lord speaks to Elijah, and he does so in a familiar passage. We hear about the still small voice or the quiet whisper. And he says to Elijah, "Hey, what are you doing here? What's this all about?" And he says, "Well, God, I'm the only one left. I have done what you wanted me to do. I have served you faithfully, but I'm the only one left that wants to serve you faithfully. And I'd rather you just go ahead and take me because she's trying to." But God speaks to him, and he begins to tell him some other things. First of all, he says, "Get up and go from here. There's a place where I want you to go, and someone that I want you to meet named Elisha, and you're going to appoint him as I've appointed him. He's going to take your place when you're done. But I'm not telling you that you're finished. In fact, the thing I really want to tell you, this is verse 18 of chapter 19 in 1 Kings. "I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, every mouth that has not kissed him." God says, I know right now you feel like you're the only one. But let me tell you something. I got 7,000 people back there in Israel. They've never stopped being faithful to me. Boy, our perspective sometimes. When Elijah was caught in these immediate circumstances, he could not see past that. And all he could see was that Jezebel would do everything in her power, using all the power in the kingdom to kill him. And he thought, I got to be the only one. But he wasn't. 7,000 that he didn't know anything about. God needed to remind him, I've got this under control, and it's never as bad as you think it is, because you can't see it from my perspective. So let me lift you up a little bit, and let me tell you something that I can see that you can't see. You see, not only do I think Elijah teaches us a lot about trust in God, I think the story of Elijah also teaches us a lot about the providential sovereignty of God. That God is a God who's in control, and things don't shock him or surprise him or sneak up on him. It's amazing to me sometimes when I think about sovereignty and providence, those two things together, because there are just some questions that arise in my mind that I don't always have the answers to about sovereignty, about when things happen, like the situation we're in right now. There's a lot of discussion about the reasons and even God's involvement in the current COVID-19 crisis. But as we think about that, it's real easy if you have a strong view of sovereignty to say, well, God did that. And God did that in order to accomplish X or Y or Z. Or if your view of sovereignty is a little bit different, maybe you would say, well, God didn't cause it, but God allowed this to happen. And because God allowed this to happen, then He's going to accomplish X and Y and Z. Or maybe your mind goes somewhere totally different. Maybe your view of sovereignty is one that suggests that God has His hands completely off and He's not doing anything and watching us as we try to navigate the mess we've made of life on planet Earth. Well, I think Elijah reminds me, and the story of Elijah reminds me that there are some things that are going on here that not everybody on the earth can see. Elijah can't even see all the things that God is doing. But God knows what God is doing because God is a sovereign. God is an in-control God. And it's never as chaotic as it seems to me right here where I sit. So I trust God because God is trustworthy. And God is trustworthy because God is able. Yahweh is a God who is in control. He can handle it. Now, in chapter 19, we find the call of Elisha, named very similar to Elijah. And we know, if we've read through this, that when Elijah is gone, Elisha will be the one who continues to carry the prophetic mantle in a real sense as it moves forward. But we're not finished yet. Chapter 20, we read about Ahab going to war and fighting with a lot of people. Then you get into this story in chapter 21. Wow, you want to see something that shows you just how cold and calculating Jezebel is. She orchestrates the murder of a man so her husband can have his vineyard. Well, he tried to get it and tried to buy it, and this man Naboth didn't want to sell it, and Jezebel says, fine, I know a way you can have it. I'll just knock him off. And if I have him killed, then there's nobody with a claim to his land. It is all yours, honey. Look what I got for you. Look what I did for you. I love you so much. Except I just don't know that Jezebel knew anything about love. She knew a lot about control. Well, God sends Elijah to go confront Ahab over what's been done. And he gives him a pretty harsh word of prophecy of coming judgment from the Lord because of this. And I want to pick up in chapter 21 of 1 Kings, verse 25. Now there was no one who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord like Ahab, whom Jezebel his wife incited. Now, pause there with me in the text. He sold himself to do evil, and he was prodded, he was incited. The gas was poured on the fire by Jezebel. He was almost acting as a puppet for what she wanted. Now let's go back to the text. This is verse 26. Now he acted very abominably in going after idols, as the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the people of Israel. But when Ahab heard those words, this wicked Ahab, when he heard those words, he tore his clothes. He put sackcloth on his flesh, and he fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about dejectedly. He was down. He believed this word, and he believed it was cause for mourning. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, have you seen how Ahab humbled himself before me? And because he has, I won't bring the disaster in his days, but in his son's days, I'll bring the disaster on his house. Now, we won't take the time to explore how that, in fact, came to pass exactly as God had promised in the days of Ahaziah. But we enter into the picture another prophet, Micaiah, in the next chapter, chapter 22, and we find Ahab who's killed in battle. The dogs of the city come and lick up his blood in fulfillment of what Elijah had told him would happen. And then we move into The next book, 2 Kings, right there chronologically in our Bibles. And I want you to go with me to chapter 2, because as we look in chapter 2, we find Elijah and Elisha working there together. And there's this real interesting exchange between the two of them throughout the next few verses there in 2 Kings chapter 2, where everybody that is a prophet seems to know Elijah's time on earth is almost over. He's going away, and he's asking Elisha particularly to stay close with him, because while it seems he knew he was going away, maybe there are some details about that he didn't know or understand. Same with Elisha. We see this really amazing thing where he basically takes off his outer garment and he rolls it up and he hits the water with it at the river where they are, and the water opens up, reminiscent of what happened with Moses and his staff, and they walk across on dry land, and they continue in this sort of an unusual conversation. But I want to pick back up in the text in verse number 9. This is 2 Kings 2, verse number 9. Now when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I'm taken from you." And Elisha said, "Well, let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." Elijah said, "You've asked a hard thing, but if you see me as I'm being taken from you, it'll be done. If you don't see me, it won't be." Now as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha cried and saw it and cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And then he saw him no more. He asked the question, where is the God of Elijah? He took Elijah's coat, it was laying there, and he struck the water, and the water opened up. God answered by saying, if you didn't see me when I just came in the fiery chariots and flaming horses and took him with me, let me show you. I hadn't gone anywhere. And it wasn't Elijah's coat. It wasn't even Elijah that opened the water. It was me. It was me doing that. So trust in me, a sovereign, trustworthy God. Now, I'm intrigued by so many parts of the story of Elijah, and time just won't permit us tonight to keep talking through all those details. I look back particularly at what happened with Ahab, and how in that moment of hearing judgment from God, Ahab truly repented. And we don't think of Ahab as a real spiritual guy, but Ahab at least had a heritage that pointed him to Yahweh and his worship. And it seems he truly repented. Now, how good he was after that, how much his life changed after that, what his relationship was like with Jezebel after that, well, some of those things are kind of hard to know, aren't they? But it just goes to show you that even someone who is so wicked that God's description through the prophetic writing of Scripture is that nobody had ever sold themselves into evil as much as Ahab did. Even a guy that wicked is not so far away from God that he can't be reached with God's message and received back by God in repentance. And God wanted to make sure Elijah knew. He said, hey, did you see it? Did you hear about that? Did you hear about Ahab? You remember Ahab? Did you hear about him tearing his clothes and putting on sackcloth and fasting? Pretty amazing how repentance even came to a wicked man like that. Well, if that teaches me anything, if that's something that could teach you anything, maybe it's that a trustworthy and sovereign God, well, there's nobody out of his reach. There's nothing he can't do. And maybe in some senses he won't do, because his will is sovereign. And what he decrees, that's what comes to pass. The rain that stopped, God stopped it. It says so. And when it came back, God brought the rain back. When things were bleak, God took care of his people. Not just Elijah, but those 7,000 other people, including the 100 prophets that Obadiah had hidden out in the caves. We didn't even talk about that tonight. God was taking care of his people. Well, that doesn't mean their bank accounts were overflowing and they never had to worry about anything. They worried, but God still kept providing. A trustworthy, sovereign God. Now, so many lessons in that for today, right? This weird time in which we're living, anxiously waiting for the economy to be restarted, for the state to be reopened, wondering what the impact is for us in churches, for Christians around the country. We're not the only country dealing with these questions and trying to decide how to move forward. There's a lot of that I don't know the answers to either. I am not a scientist or a doctor. I'm not a government official. I'm not an economist. So, what would I do? Well, two things I would tell you. One, trust through whatever circumstances you're living in a sovereign and trustworthy God. And secondly, don't ever think that what you see is the only perspective or God's perspective. Two things show us that. One, we see that God had a different perspective than Elijah when Elijah wanted to die and thought he was all alone. God could see something he couldn't. But I think the same thing is true of Ahab. If you'd ask Elijah, is Ahab a good guy? Is he somebody that can be moved or impacted by a word from the Lord? Ahab, well, he didn't look like it, and Elijah might have been tempted to say, no, are you kidding? But God could see something in someone that Elijah couldn't see. None of us could see. We didn't see that coming. There's a lot of people around us that may not be what we think they ought to be. We may think God's written them off, that God could never reach them, that the gospel could never mean anything to them. Don't forget, in all your circumstances, God can see what you and I can't see. Let's trust him to keep being Yahweh God. And let's see what he can do far beyond our wildest dreams. Thanks for stopping by.